A mother betrayed, a baby dying, a stranger with blood on his hands, trapped in a blizzard with killers closing in. The twist will leave you speechless. Watch till the end. The snow slammed down like a curse from above, a raging white monster that roared across the endless plains, clawing away every footprint, every sign of the trail behind her. Anna Pierce staggered forward, her thin shawl yanked tight over her trembling shoulders, her tiny baby pressed so hard against her chest she could feel the child's weak pulse fluttering against her ribs. Each step was a war, her boots sinking into the drifts, her legs dragging like they hauled a coffin through quicksand. The baby whimpered, a faint, pitiful sound that barely broke through the storm's howl, her small body swinging between fever-hot and ice-cold, her breaths so shallow they seemed to vanish. Anna wouldn't cry, couldn't afford to. The freezing wind would steal her tears, turning them to frost before they hit the ground. Her boots, patched and threadbare, had lost their fight with the cold long ago, torn open at the seams, letting the snow seep in. She couldn't feel her toes, couldn't feel much below her knees. Her legs shook violently, her knees buckled, and she lurched sideways, slamming her hand against a jagged tree stump to keep from falling. The baby slipped in her arms, and a raw, searing panic ripped through her chest, the only warmth she had left in this frozen nightmare. "Shoo, hush now, it's all right, little one," she whispered, but the words tasted like dust, dry and hollow, a lie she couldn't make real. The baby's name was Sadie, just 6 months old, her dark curls matted with sweat and snow, her eyes shut tight, her face pale as death. She'd gone too quiet, her silence louder than the storm, and it gnawed at Anna's soul like a starving wolf. With clumsy, frost-bitten fingers, she tugged at the damp cloth swaddling Sadie, peeling it back to press the child's icy skin against her own bare chest. She hoped her heartbeat, faint as it was, could pour some life into her daughter, could keep her holding on. She had to move, had to keep going. If she stopped here, the snow would pile over them, a white grave swallowing them whole before dawn. Behind her, the horizon had devoured the last flicker of the wagon party's torches, those hateful, double-tongued vipers she'd once called kin. Their voices echoed in her skull. Reverend Asa Thorne's slimy grin as he preached her damnation, Edith Thorne's sharp, pinched glare cutting her down, and loudest of all, James Cutler's cold, cruel shout, "She's not my burden anymore. That kid's not mine." Lies, every word dripping with venom, built on his cowardice and their spite. Out here, truth was a dead thing. Only the votes of weak men mattered, men too scared to stand up, too loud to let her defend herself. They'd thrown her out like spoiled meat, a broken tool, without even a scrap of cloth to shield her from the blizzard's bite. Anna gritted her teeth, her jaw aching from the strain, and forced herself upright. Every bone in her body groaned, every muscle screamed for rest, but she wouldn't give in. The wind lashed her face, tearing at her skin until it bled, the sting a cruel reminder she was still alive. She trudged on, one brutal step after another, her breath puffing out in short, ragged clouds. The flat plain stretched forever, then finally gave way to a dense wall of pine trees, their branches sagging under the snow's weight. Moonlight sliced through the gaps, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground, shapes that flickered and moved, like ghosts stalking her every step. She squinted through the storm, her eyes burning, and spotted a shallow nook between two rocks, their surfaces crusted with ice. It wasn't a cave, wasn't much of anything, just a dip in the earth, a frail shield against the wind's fury, but it was something. Her hands, numb and bloody, clawed at the frozen dirt. Her knuckles scraped raw against the ice, skin peeling back, but she kept digging, carving out a small pit. Her breath came in gasps, her chest heaving as she snapped brittle branches from the trees, piling them into the hollow. She laid Sadie down as gently as her shaking arms allowed, then curled herself around her daughter, her body a wall against the cold, a mother's last stand in the wild. The silence wasn't calm, it pulsed with danger. The trees creaked and moaned, their trunks bending like they might snap and crush her. A coyote's sharp bark cut through the night, too close for comfort, its echo bouncing off the rocks. Another answered, then a third, circling, hunting, their cries weaving a net of threat around her. Anna's heart pounded, a frantic drumbeat in her chest. She'd grown up in Georgia, where winters were tame, rain-soaked earth and muddy trails, not this white death that froze your blood and stole your hope. Her father had sat her down with the Bible, teaching her to trace the words of salvation with her small fingers, but he'd never shown her how to spark a flame from wood that crackled with frost. What use were verses about grace when her baby was slipping away? Still, she tried. She fumbled in her pocket for a piece of flint, her last keepsake from a life that felt like a dream now, and scraped it against a stone she'd pried from the ground. Sparks jumped, tiny bursts of light that danced in the dark, then faded into nothing. She scraped again, harder, her fingers slipping, her nails splitting. Nothing. Sadie's cries dwindled to a thin, broken thread, then stopped altogether. Anna pressed her cheek to her daughter's forehead, cold as a river stone. "Don't you go quiet on me, Sadie," she hissed, her voice raw and fierce. "You stay loud, you stay alive. Fight like your mama, you hear me?" The wind howled louder, a beast unleashed, carrying voices that weren't real but cut just the same, cruel, jagged shards of memory. James Cutler's laugh, sharp and mocking, slicing through her mind like a knife. Reverend Asa Thorne's booming sermons, thick with fake pity, damning her to hell. Her sister's silence, a wall of ice between them. Her mother's soft, disappointed sigh, heavy with shame. She squeezed her eyes shut and screamed into the snow, but her voice broke, frail and small, like a bird beating its wings against a locked cage. Night thickened, pressing down like a weight she couldn't lift. The fire wouldn't catch. No matter how many times she struck the flint, the sparks taunted her, flaring and dying in the same breath. Sadie's chest barely rose, her breaths so faint Anna had to hold her own to feel them. "No, no, you don't get to leave me," she sobbed, yanking her daughter closer. She pounded her fist against her own chest, desperate to force warmth into her arms, into Sadie's tiny frame. "Stay with me, little one. I brought you here. I'll get you out, I swear it on my life." But the truth sank in, cold and heavy as the snow piling around them. It might not be enough. The drifts climbed higher, whispering promises of a quiet end. Her body slumped, too exhausted to hold itself up. Her vision blurred, the world fading to gray at the edges. Her lips moved in a prayer she couldn't voice. No sound, just a silent cry to a sky that had turned its back. Then, a sound pierced the storm. Hoofbeats, soft and distant, thudding through the snow, growing louder, closer, insistent. She lifted her head, slow and heavy, her neck stiff with cold. Wolves. Or worse, men from the wagon party, come to make sure she was dead, to stamp out the last flicker of her defiance. A rider broke through the trees, a tall, dark figure cloaked in thick furs, his lean horse moving silently through the drifts, its hooves barely touching the ground. He dismounted with a smooth, eerie grace, his boots leaving no crunch, no mark in the snow. The cold didn't seem to reach him. He stood tall, unshaken, a shadow carved from the night itself. Anna couldn't move, couldn't speak, her chin trembling as she tried to look up. He stepped closer. Dark braids swung against his shoulders, framing a face hard as granite, weathered by wind and time. His eyes caught the moonlight, glinting like fire where no fire burned, deep, piercing, alive with a secret she couldn't grasp. A long rifle hung across his back, its barrel catching the faint light. A sharp blade gleamed at his hip, its edge whispering of blood. Her lips cracked open, dry and bleeding. "Please," she rasped, the words scraping out of her throat like a plea to a stranger god. He knelt beside her, his gaze flicking to Sadie first, lingering on the child's still form, then shifting to Anna. His brow furrowed, deep lines etching his face. Anger? Pity? She couldn't tell. She tried to sit up, to show him she wasn't done, wasn't ready to die, but her arms shook and gave out, collapsing under her weight. He didn't speak, didn't hesitate. He unhooked a thick buffalo hide from his saddle, its edges stiff with frost, and draped it over them both. The warmth crashed into her like a thunderbolt. She gasped, her lungs burning as life rushed back. He lifted them, mother and child together, as if they were nothing, light as a breath in his arms. He climbed onto his horse, settled them against his chest, and turned back into the woods, the storm swallowing the sound of his ride. The last thing she felt was the steady thud of his heartbeat, strong and unyielding, a lifeline in the dark as her mind slipped away. When she woke, the air was thick with a scent of smoke and roasted meat, not the bitter icy sting of the blizzard she'd left behind. Her eyes fluttered open, struggling against a warm, flickering light that stung her frostbitten face. They were in a small hut, its walls rough-hewn from logs, patched with mud and moss. A fire crackled in the center of the dirt floor, its flames licking at a spit where something small, a rabbit, maybe, sizzled and popped. Smoke curled upward, drifting through a hole in the roof, the only window to the world outside. Sadie lay beside her, bundled in soft furs, her cheeks flushed pink again, her chest rising and falling with steady, living breaths, alive, miraculously alive. Anna sat up, her head spinning with a relief so sharp it brought tears she couldn't stop. She wiped them away with a trembling hand, her fingers brushing the rough edge of the furs. Across the room, the man sat cross-legged on a woven mat, sharpening a long blade with slow, deliberate strokes. The sound, stone grinding against steel, was steady, almost hypnotic, a rhythm that pulled her back to the present. "You saved us," she said, her voice hoarse and cracked, barely above a whisper. He didn't look up, didn't answer, his hands never pausing. "I don't have anything to give you," she went on, shame twisting in her gut. "No money, no goods, just my thanks, and it's not enough, but I mean it, more than you'll ever know." Still, he stayed silent, his focus on the blade. She swallowed hard, her throat dry as sand. "I'm Anna Pierce." He lifted his head at last, his gaze locking onto hers, steady and unreadable, like a lake hiding its depths. "I'm not interested in your name," he said, his voice low and smooth, rolling like distant thunder. She blinked, caught off guard, her breath hitching. He nodded toward Sadie, nestled in the furs beside her. "What's hers?" "Sadie," she replied, her voice softening as she glanced at her daughter. He grunted, a sound that wasn't harsh, almost gentle, like a nod of respect. "She's a fighter." Anna let out a shaky laugh, her chest tight with emotion. "Takes after her mama, I guess, too stubborn to quit." Something flickered across his face, not a smile, but something smaller, deeper, a crack in the stone wall he wore. "I thought we'd die out there," she said, her words trembling with the weight of it. "Do you believe in miracles?" "I believe in action," he answered, his eyes dropping back to the blade, his hands resuming their steady work. They sat there for a long stretch, the fire snapping and popping between them, casting shadows that danced on the rough walls. She watched him from the corner of her eye. His hands moved with precision, every swipe of the stone against steel controlled, purposeful, like a ritual he'd done 1,000 times. The blade gleamed in the firelight, its edge sharp and deadly, a warrior's tool forged for survival, maybe for vengeance. She studied his face, hard lines etched by wind and sun, dark braids framing eyes that held secrets she couldn't touch. "You Apache?" she asked, keeping her voice low, almost afraid to break the quiet. He nodded once, a single curt dip of his chin, his expression unchanged. "Why'd you help me?" she pressed, needing to understand, to peel back even a corner of his mystery. He didn't answer right away, just stared into the flames, the light playing across his features, highlighting the scars that crisscrossed his knuckles. Then, after a pause that stretched into forever, "You didn't scream when you saw me. You held your child tighter instead." The words landed like stones, simple but heavy with meaning she couldn't fully grasp. She opened her mouth to ask more, his name, his story, where they were, why he roamed alone, but her body betrayed her. Exhaustion crashed over her like a tide, pulling her down into the furs. She let it take her, her head sinking back, her eyes drifting shut, trusting the fire would still burn when she woke, that this stranger wouldn't vanish into the night. Outside, the snow fell softer now, the storm's rage fading to a whisper, the world holding its breath. But far off, on the edge of the horizon, a new shadow loomed, a storm gathering strength, clouds piling high, lightning flickering in the distance, waiting to strike. Inside, warmth wrapped around them, a fragile shield against the cold. For now, it held. She didn't know yet that this man carried a wound deeper than any blade could cut. She didn't know he'd lost a family once. Wife, child, home, taken by fire and steel in a war he couldn't stop, a betrayal that drove him from his people into this lonely wild. She didn't know the silence he wore like a second skin hid a grief that mirrored her own, a pain that fueled every step he took. She didn't know he'd soon become the one soul who'd stand against an army to keep her and Sadie breathing. But she'd learn, slowly, painfully, through blood and fire. Days turned into a blur of survival. The hut wasn't safe for long. One night, shouts shattered the quiet, bounty hunters, their torches blazing like angry stars in the dark, their voices barking orders through the trees. Jonah Creed, that's what he'd finally told her his name was, bled from a gunshot wound he wouldn't talk about, a red stain spreading across his side as they fled. Sadie clung to Anna's chest, her tiny hands gripping her mother's shirt, her breath warm and alive against her skin. They ran through the snow, boots crunching, hearts pounding, the cold biting at their heels. The hunters' dogs bayed in the distance, their howls weaving through the wind, closing in. Jonah led them to a canyon, its walls rising sharp and jagged against the sky. They slipped into a cave, a narrow, twisting mouth in the rock that swallowed them whole. Inside, the air was cool and damp, the walls muffling the shouts outside. Torches flickered on the ridge above, moving closer, then farther, then closer again, their light casting long, eerie shadows through the cracks. "They'll find us," Anna whispered, her voice tight with dread, her arms wrapped around Sadie. Jonah crouched by the entrance, his knife glinting in his hand, his rifle propped beside him. "Not yet," he said, his tone dark and certain. "But they're coming, more than before." She clutched Sadie tighter, her daughter's warmth the only anchor in the dark. "How many?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Too many," he replied, his eyes scanning the shadows beyond the cave. "Men with guns, men with dogs, men who don't stop." Her stomach twisted. "I don't want to run forever," she said, her words barely audible over the wind howling outside the cave, rattling loose stones. He turned to her, his eyes burning with something fierce, something unbroken. "Then maybe it's time we stop running," he said. "Maybe it's time we fight, make them regret chasing us." Weeks stretched into months, each day a battle to hold on. They escaped the cave when the hunters drew too close, their dogs sniffing at the entrance, their shouts echoing down the canyon. Jonah carried Sadie part of the way, his wound slowing him, but his grip never faltered. They found a hidden valley, far from the trails of men, a pocket of earth cradled by hills and thick pines. They built a cabin from logs they felled themselves, their hands blistered and bleeding as they stacked stones for a chimney that puffed smoke into the sky. Corn sprouted in uneven rows, fighting the rocky soil, its green tips a fragile promise of life. Sadie grew stronger, over a year old now, toddling on chubby legs across the dirt floor, her dark hair wild and tangled, her laugh loud and fearless, a spark of her mother's fire blazing bright. Anna stood on the porch one morning, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, the scent of wood smoke and wildflowers clinging to her skin, mixing with the earth on her fingers. Jonah stepped out behind her, his limp still there from the wound that refused to heal clean, a scar that pulled at his side with every step. He leaned against the post, watching her with a faint, rare smile, one she'd learned to seek out, a quiet gift he rarely gave. "She's walking now," he said, nodding at Sadie, who chased a beetle across the porch, giggling as it scuttled away. Anna laughed, a sound that felt strange but good, like sunlight after a storm. "She's running when I'm not watching. Takes after you, quiet but unstoppable, like a shadow with a mind of its own." He tilted his head, his eyes glinting with something soft. "Silence can protect," he said. "But the fire's in her blood." He didn't say whose blood. He didn't need to. It was theirs, forged together in the dark. Their peace was a thin thread, stretched tight, ready to snap. One day, as the sun climbed high, a rider appeared on the horizon, a lone figure riding fast, kicking up dust that billowed like a warning cloud across the valley. Anna set Sadie in her cradle, her hands brushing the worn wood, and stepped into the yard, her fingers grazing the rifle propped by the door, its cold metal a comfort. Jonah emerged from the woods on the far side of the clearing, a bow slung over his shoulder, a brace of rabbits dangling from his belt, their fur matted with blood. He saw the rider too, and his steps quickened, his face hardening into a mask she'd come to know. Danger was near. The man pulled up just outside the fence, his horse lathered and trembling, its flanks heaving with exhaustion. He was lean, sweat-soaked, his eyes wide with panic, darting between them. "You Jonah Creed?" he asked, his voice ragged, breaking on the words. Jonah didn't answer, just stared, his silence a wall. The man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "Name's Miles Ford. Rode from Fort Taylor, 3 days straight, no sleep. They're coming, soldiers, marshals, maybe 20, maybe 30, more every hour. Say you're hiding a fugitive. Say she killed Reverend Asa Thorne, torched a settlement. Say you're a traitor who burned villages, killed women and children." Anna's stomach dropped, a cold weight settling there. "Reverend Asa Thorne deserved it," she snapped, her voice sharp as a blade. "He beat me, starved me, called me a sinner for breathing. And I didn't burn anything. They did, to cover their own filth." Miles shook his head, guilt heavy in his eyes, his hands trembling on the reins. "They don't care, ma'am. They want blood, yours, his, the kids if they have to. I owed Jonah, saved my brother in Sonora years back, pulled him out of a river when the army left him to drown. Couldn't let them take you without a warning." "Thank you," Jonah said, his voice low and steady, like a drumbeat before a storm. Miles nodded once, turned his horse, and vanished into the trees, the dust settling behind him like a shroud. Anna stood frozen, the wind picking up, tugging at her hair, whistling through the pines. The sky darkened, clouds rolling in thick and gray, heavy with threat. "How long?" she asked, her voice small, barely cutting through the growing roar. "Less than a day," Jonah said, his gaze scanning the hills, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. "We run again?" she asked, dread pooling in her chest, her fingers tightening on the rifle. He shook his head, slow and sure, his jaw set. "We've run enough, too long, too far. So we fight." He turned to her, fire flaring in his eyes. Not rage, but resolve, hard as iron, deep as the earth. "We defend what's ours. They don't take this. Not the cabin, not Sadie, not you. Not while I'm still standing." The cabin turned into a fortress in hours, a desperate scramble against time. They boarded the windows with planks they ripped from the shed, the nails screeching as they drove them in. They hauled buckets of water from the creek, the cold splashing over their hands, soaking their clothes. They stashed food, dried meat, hard bread, a sack of cornmeal, and bullets in the root cellar, its trapdoor hidden under a rug. Jonah set traps around the perimeter, snares that hissed in the grass like snakes, tripwires that gleamed faintly in the dusk, deadfalls rigged with rocks and logs to crush bone and break wills. Anna cleaned the rifle, her hand steady as she counted each bullet. 23, enough if she aimed true, not enough if she didn't. She tied a knife to her thigh, its weight a grim comfort against her leg, and slipped a smaller blade into her boot, just in case. Fear had burned out of her long ago, replaced by something harder, something that wouldn't bend or break. Not now, not ever. That night, Sadie slept between them on the floor, her soft snores cutting through the wind's howl, a fragile thread of peace in the dark. Coyotes cried in the distance, their voices sharp and restless, joined by the low growl of thunder rolling closer. Anna lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for hooves, for shouts, for the crack of gunfire. Jonah reached over, his calloused hand finding hers, his grip firm. "If we fall," she whispered, her voice trembling despite herself, "they'll take her." "No," he said, his voice a vow carved in stone, unyielding. "You can't promise that." "Yes, I can," he said, his eyes locking onto hers in the dim light. "I'll die before they touch her." She turned to him, her breath catching, her eyes wide and searching. "Then we don't fall," she said, her words a pact, a line drawn in the dirt. Dawn broke red and vicious, the sky bleeding over the hills, streaked with clouds that looked like wounds. Dust rose in the distance, a faint rumble growing into the steady thunder of hooves, like a war drum calling down ruin, shaking the earth beneath them. They came over the ridge, blue-coated soldiers, grim lawmen, rifles gleaming in the early light, a banner snapping in the wind, its edges frayed and stained. Anna counted 18, then 20, then more, 30 at least, their numbers swelling as they spread out, a tide of steel and hate. A gray-bearded marshal rode at the front, his face smug, his eyes glinting with triumph, his voice booming across the valley like a cannon shot. "Bring out the woman and the Apache. Lay down your weapons, and we'll give you a fair trial, justice under the law." Anna stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, Sadie tucked behind her in the cradle, her small hands clutching her spoon. "Fair like you gave me last time," she shouted back, her voice steady, cutting through the wind. "When you left me to die in the snow. When you beat me bloody and called it God's will. I'll take my chances with the devil I know." The marshal sneered, his lip curling, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "You've got a child there. Don't make her pay for your crimes, woman. Don't make this uglier than it needs to be." Jonah appeared beside her, bow drawn taut, arrow notched, knife at his belt, his stance solid as the hills behind them. "She's not the one who'll pay," he said, his voice cold and final, like a judge's gavel slamming down, like a promise written in blood. The marshal raised a hand, his grin twisting, and hell broke loose. Gunfire roared, splitting the air, a storm of lead and smoke. The first wave didn't reach the fence. 3 men dropped, snared in traps, their screams choked off as ropes snapped tight around their throats, dragging them down. Another fell to a spike buried in the dirt, his body crumpling like a broken toy, blood pooling beneath him. Jonah's arrows flew, a blur of death. 5 shots, 5 hits, each man falling before he could aim, their rifles clattering to the ground. Anna braced the rifle against her shoulder, breathed deep, and fired. 2 shots, 2 kills, her aim steady as stone, her hands unshaken. The fight was chaos, loud, brutal, relentless. Smoke thickened, stinging her eyes, choking her lungs. A soldier breached the door, his rifle raised, his face twisted with rage. Anna lunged, driving her knife into his throat before he could shout, his blood spraying hot and slick across her hands. She yanked the blade free, stepping over him as he gurgled and fell. Outside, Jonah fought in the yard, his blade flashing in the sunlight, cutting through men like a reaper through wheat, his movements precise, deadly, unstoppable. They fought like they were born for it, like the land itself had forged them for this moment, had chosen them to stand. When the gunfire stopped, the field was a graveyard, silent but for the wind. Bodies lay twisted and still, scattered across the dirt like fallen leaves. The marshal sprawled among them, his smug face frozen in shock, his last wild shot buried in the cabin wall, splintering the wood. Anna dropped to her knees beside Sadie, who sat blinking calmly by her cradle, chewing her wooden spoon like the world hadn't just burned around her, her dark eyes wide but unafraid. Jonah limped toward them, blood soaking his shirt, some his, most not, his breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. "You're hurt," she said, her voice tight with worry, her hands reaching for him. He shook his head, grimacing, one hand pressed to his side. "It's done for now." She stood, her legs trembling, and looked at the wreckage. Scorched earth, broken bodies, the cabin scarred but standing. "What now?" she asked, her breath catching in her throat, her eyes scanning the hills for more shadows. "We bury the dead," he said, his tone flat but firm, his gaze steady despite the pain. By sundown, they'd cleared the field, dragging bodies to a pit beyond the trees, the work slow and grueling. Their hands blistered, their backs ached, but they didn't stop until the last man was gone. The last wisps of smoke curled into the evening sky, gray against the orange dusk, a faint haze lingering over the valley. They lit a fire, not for warmth, not for food, but to cleanse the air, to burn away the day's weight, its violence, its ghosts. Anna sat beside it, Sadie asleep in her lap, her small chest rising and falling peacefully, her face soft in the firelight. Jonah stood nearby, silent as ever, his eyes locked on the flames, their light dancing in his dark gaze, reflecting a storm she couldn't see. "We didn't start this," she said, her voice soft but sure, cutting through the crackle of the fire. "No," he agreed, his tone matching hers, low and heavy. "But we ended it. At least this piece of it." She looked at him, something blooming inside her, stronger than survival, deeper than gratitude, a bond forged in blood and fire, tempered by every step they'd taken together. "We're a family now," she said. "Not because we chose it, because we made it, fight by fight, night by night, through every shadow that tried to break us." He met her gaze, his voice steady as the earth beneath them, unwavering. "Family made in fire." The words hung there, heavy with truth, a promise unspoken but unbreakable, sealed in the heat of the flames. Anna tilted her head back, staring at the sky, stars breaking through the dusk, bright and defiant, a map of light above their hard-won home. "This land knows our names now," she said, her voice rising, firm with conviction. "Let them come again. Soldiers, hunters, liars, cowards. We'll still be here, standing, breathing, fighting." For the first time in years, she believed it, bone deep, soul deep, a certainty that rooted her to this place. She pressed her lips to Sadie's forehead, feeling her daughter's warmth, her life, then looked at Jonah, the man who'd never turned away, who'd carried her through the dark, who'd bled for her without a word. "Let's build something that lasts," she said, her voice firm, her eyes locked on his. He nodded once, the faintest shadow of a smile tugging at his lips, a rare crack in his armor. "We already are," he said, his words quiet but solid, a foundation laid. But the story didn't end there. Not yet, not even close. That night, as the fire died to glowing embers, a sound drifted on the wind. Hooves, faint but growing, a whisper of more to come, a shadow moving closer. Anna's eyes snapped open, her hand tightening on the rifle beside her, her heart kicking hard in her chest. Jonah was already up, peering into the dark beyond the porch, his knife drawn, his body tense but steady. "They're not done," he said, his voice low and dangerous, a warning wrapped in steel. She stood, Sadie stirring in her arms, a soft whimper escaping her lips. "Then neither are we," she replied, fire flaring in her chest, her grip on the rifle unyielding. Whatever came next, men with guns, storms with teeth, shadows with no name, they'd face it together. And they'd win, or they'd die trying. Days later, the hoofbeats returned, not one rider, but many, their rhythm a drumbeat of war echoing through the valley. Anna spotted them first, dark shapes cresting the hill, their coats glinting with badges, their rifles raised high. Jonah stood beside her, his bow in hand, his face a mask of stone. "More soldiers?" she asked, her voice tight. "Worse," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Bounty hunters, men who don't care about law, only gold." She swallowed hard, her hand brushing Sadie's hair as the child slept inside, unaware. "How many this time?" "Enough to test us," he said, his tone grim. "But not enough to win." She nodded, her jaw set. "Then let's test them first." The fight came fast and fierce, a storm of bullets and blood. Traps snapped, men screamed, arrows flew, and Anna's rifle barked with every shot, her aim true, her heart steady. When it ended, the valley was quiet again, the hunters scattered or dead, their greed buried with them. But as the smoke cleared, a letter fluttered from a dead man's coat. Orders, signed with a name Jonah knew, a name from his past, a ghost that wouldn't stay buried. He stared at it, his face darkening, his silence heavier than ever. "What is it?" Anna asked, stepping closer, her voice soft but urgent. "Someone who wants me dead," he said, his words clipped. "Someone who'll keep sending more until he gets me, or I get him." She met his gaze, unflinching. "Then we get him first." He nodded, a spark of something, trust, maybe hope, flashing in his eyes. "Together," he said. "Together," she echoed, the word a vow, a weapon, a shield. The valley held its breath, the stars watching, the land waiting. Their fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But they were ready.